Beverly felt a chill race along her spine the moment she heard the frantic splashing. She and her husband Martin had been casually strolling by the community pool, an oasis that usually bustled with summer cheer. This wasn't the usual carefree laughter or playful shouting. It was unbridled terror. Her eyes darted across the pool deck, searching for the source in a shallow end. A child's beach ball floated aimlessly, bobbing against the concrete edge. A lifeguard no older than 20 stood frozen on her elevated chair beyond her. At the deeper end, something thrashed in the water. Someone was drowning. Beverly sucked in a breath so sharply she coughed. Martin gasped, and without hesitation he shouted, "Help her, someone help her!" The strangest thing was the hush from the other lifeguards. 2 more staffers in bright red swim trunks were gathered near the water's edge, arms crossed over their official t-shirts. They watched the struggling figure with what looked like a mixture of concern and hesitation. Beverly could almost see the indecision shining in their eyes. It was so unnatural. Lifeguards are trained to save people to spring into action. But these 3 just stood there, eyes darting to each other, as if waiting for someone else to give them permission to move. In that fraction of a second, Beverly remembered the HOA's edict circulating through the neighborhood rumor mill. The dreaded No 9/11 policy. She heard the chatter in the clubhouse lounge a few weeks prior. The Homeowners Association board, in an attempt to keep the community's incident reports low, for insurance and property value reasons, had issued a quiet directive only, call 911, after permission from an HOA official. No exceptions for months. Any major problems at the pool had been quietly handled without official emergency calls. Unless it was absolutely unavoidable, the board insisted it was for the good of the community to minimize unnecessary costs and harmful publicity. Beverly thought that was an ugly rumor, an exaggeration that had sprouted from neighborhood gossip. But suddenly the possibility looked very real. The older lifeguard with broad shoulders and tired eyes seemed to waver. He finally turned and made a move toward the phone. But the sight of the cordless receiver reminded Beverly of the rumored policy. He must have been wrestling with it, follow standard safety training, or heed the board's stern directive. The moment stretched like taffy as the drowning swimmer's arms slapped at the water in a desperate attempt to keep afloat. A gurgling cry for help cut through the scorching afternoon air. Martin leaped into action. He sprinted to the pool's edge, bellowing at the top of his lungs. "What are you waiting for?" The next instant, he was in the pool clothes, and all Beverly's throat was dry, her heart hammering in her chest. The lifeguards appeared paralyzed until the younger one climbed down from the lifeguard stand and grabbed a flotation device. But something else was holding him back. Fear, a whistle finally blew, shrill and piercing. The younger guard dove in with the float. Martin was flailing, trying to keep the victim's head above water. Beverly darted around the perimeter, grabbing at the phone on the pool office wall. But a surly voice behind her shouted, "Ma'am, you can't use that phone." She recognized the tone of someone from the HOA board, or at least someone who thought they had authority. The big block letters above the office phone read, "Emergency only." But evidently the local definition of emergency had changed by the time she managed to punch in 911 on her cell. Everything seemed to happen at once. The young lifeguard had reached the drowning victim. Martin was treading water chest deep. Trying his best to assist, the older lifeguard finally overcame his hesitation and reached out to help pull the victim toward the pool edge. So much commotion in what felt like slow motion. Beverly's phone rang twice. Then a dispatcher's voice crackled on the line. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" "It's the Fairview Lake community pool," Beverly stammered. "Somebody's drowning and it looks bad. We need an ambulance." Her voice echoed across the quiet neighborhood within minutes. The paramedics arrived, but it felt like a century. The victim, a middle-aged woman named Jillian, who lived 3 blocks away, was lifted out of the water. She was unresponsive, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. The paramedics administered CPR right on the deck, commanding the crowd to stand back. Beverly's hands began to tremble. Martin stood dripping in the background chest, heaving face slack with horror. The lifeguards hovered uncertainly, their expressions haunted by an unspoken question. Could they have saved her sooner if they hadn't hesitated as the ambulance finally sped away, siren echoing into the distance? No one could shake the lingering question. Why hadn't someone called 911 right away? The crowd that had gathered murmured among themselves, subdued anger and shock. In their eyes, Beverly overheard a few harsh whispers about the HOA's No 9/11 policy. Disbelief and outrage rippled through onlookers who had once dismissed it as nothing more than rumor. But the story was so preposterous, it was almost easier to assume it was a misunderstanding. That evening, Beverly and Martin learned the grim news: Jillian never regained consciousness. She died at the hospital. The official word from the paramedics was that the delay might have cost her precious minutes. The group chat on Beverly's phone exploded with heartbreak and fury. They told them not to call. 911 read one message. HOA worried about bad PR typed another. Her family is devastated. It was more than heartbreak or shock. It was betrayal. Beverly's entire outlook on her peaceful gated community was beginning to shift. A sinister question latched on her mind. What mattered more to these HOA leaders, human life or good public relations? The night after Jillian's death, a thick air of disquiet settled over Fairview Lake. Normally, this was a picturesque suburban retreat. Well-manicured lawns, neat rows of mailboxes, and serene walking paths illuminated by warm streetlights. But that evening, as Beverly peered through a living room window, the community felt colder, like someone had turned off a switch that once made it feel welcoming and safe. A cluster of neighbors gathered by the fence bordering the pool, their hushed voices drifting through the darkness. Word had spread fast. There was something deeply troubling about a directive that specifically limited calling 911. In times of emergency, Beverly cannot wrap her mind around it. Each text message she read only made her blood pressure rise. She and Martin discussed it over dinner. The clatter of utensils felt jarringly loud compared to their tense silence. What exactly do they gain from forbidding lifeguards to call 911? Martin asked. Pushing his plate aside, I can't fathom why they would take such a risk. It must be insurance premiums, Beverly replied, recalling the rumors about the board's obsession with minimizing official incident reports. If it gets out that there was a drowning or near drowning, it goes on record and can spike the HOA's liability insurance. The board was apparently determined to keep the community's record clean. Martin's brow furrowed as he considered the implications. So they'd rather risk someone's life than deal with a little paperwork or increase fees that's monstrous. He shoved his chair back, unable to contain his anger. We have to do something. We can't let them keep running things like this. The next morning, Beverly decided to attend the impromptu meeting that was scheduled at the small community clubhouse. Where on the neighborhood chat was that board president Darlene Scott would be there presumably to do damage control when Beverly arrived. The large meeting room was already packed. Families huddled in corners, older folks in neat cardigans, a few staff members from the management company, and at least 3 lifeguards who looked uncomfortable to be in the spotlight. The crowd parted in hushed tension as the slender figure Darlene took to the front of the room. Darlene wore a crisp blazer and clutched-up binder stuffed with documents. Her expression was resolute, but her voice trembled slightly as she greeted the crowd. Good morning, Fairview Lake residents. I realize we are all heartbroken by the tragedy yesterday. Let's start by offering our condolences to the family. She paused and the crowd murmured in sad agreement. Yet the tension in the air was palpable. Beverly noticed how Darlene avoided eye contact with a row of lifeguards. One of them, the older guard from the incident, was wringing his cap in his hands. Gaze fixed on the floor. The father of the victim's best friend stood near the back eyes. Ablaze a few seats away, Martin was leaning forward, arms crossed as if daring Darlene to spin any more illusions. The first person to speak was Malene, an outspoken resident with a booming voice. What is this rule about not calling 911? She demanded, arms folded tight over her chest. I've heard rumors for months, and now it's cost a life. We need an explanation. Darlene fumbled with her binder, flipping through pages as though searching for a prepared statement. It wasn't our intention to restrict emergency services, she began, voice quivering slightly. We merely wanted our staff to follow a protocol to notify a board member first, so we could coordinate the response properly and ensure swift action. Swift action? Martin echoed his tone, scathing. Are you suggesting that calling a board member is faster than dialing 911? That's absurd. The paramedics are trained professionals. Your protocol cost Jillian her life. Someone else in the crowd shouted, "We've seen the directive emails, don't pretend they don't exist." A murmur of agreement passed through the audience. Darlene lifted her hands, pleading for calm. "I'm not denying we instructed the guards to consult us before calling 911, but it was never meant to inhibit anyone from seeking emergency help. We only wanted to handle lesser incidents internally, like a slip and fall that wasn't serious. We wanted to reduce unnecessary calls." A lifeguard in the front row cleared his throat. He glanced around nervously before speaking. "I'm Peter, the one who jumped in. After Miss Connolly, we were told not to call 911 unless absolutely necessary. And absolutely necessary meant you, Miss Scott, or another board member had to verbally confirm it. We had it drilled into us that a single 911 call would lead to a tarnished safety record." A hush fell over the room. Darlene's face went pale as she was confronted with her own words. She tried to protest, but it was too late. "Wait, I never..." The point was, Maline's sharp voice cut her off. "How is a drowning not absolutely necessary? This is revolting." As the anger swelled, Darlene made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "We'll, of course, reassess our policies. We are conducting an internal review. But I must emphasize we're not certain the delay contributed to her death. It's in the hands of the authorities now." The roar of voices that followed drowned her out. Residents were enraged. "You think you can bury this with an internal review? Tell that to Jillian's daughter. We're not fools. You're trying to save face." Sensing the growing hostility, Darlene hastily adjourned the meeting, promising an emergency board session would be held. Soon people spilled out of the clubhouse fury, unbridled, forming small clusters as they argued about next steps. Beverly and Martin stood with a group near the exit where they discussed the potential for lawsuits. Others spoke of petitioning for a complete overhaul of the board. The day-scorching sun did little to disperse the chill that settled over the community. Even as some residents calmed down, a dark, heavy cloud persisted. The entire fiasco felt like a betrayal of trust by those chosen to manage and protect the neighborhood for many. It wasn't just about how Jillian died, but also about how the HOA valued appearances over human life that night. Beverly found it impossible to rest. She mulled over how such an ugly policy came to be, and how they could ensure nothing like this would ever happen again. Beverly's anxiety built steadily in the days after the meeting, culminating in a restless night, haunted by images of Jillian's final moments. She felt compelled to uncover how the HOA had slithered its way into adopting such a cold-hearted directive. She refused to believe it was only about insurance savings. There had to be more to this story. People simply don't put a cost on a life without some larger incentive or systemic issue. After a sleepless dawn, she decided to do some digging. She began by searching the online resident portal, sifting through archived newsletters and board announcements. Most of it was routine updates on landscaping, water usage restrictions, and clubhouse reservations. Finally, she came across a curious note in the minutes of a board meeting from 6 months prior, Item 7, Liability and Incident Mitigation Strategy. The board discussed methods to reduce any negative perception of Fairview Lakes. Public amenities, proposed guidelines were outlined to ensure minimal external reporting of incidents that do not require urgent medical intervention. It was vague, but telling. Beverly recognized some of the language used by Darlene at the clubhouse coordinated response. Minimal external reporting, avoid harmful publicity. The more she read, the more she believed the board was systematically discouraging 911 calls to keep the community's safety statistics pristine. But why did they hope to expand the pool or build new amenities that might be overshadowed by a record of injuries armed with her digital notes? Beverly set out to speak with a few longtime residents who had witnessed the HOA's evolution firsthand. She started with Irene, an older woman who'd lived in Fairview Lake since its inception. Irene's porch was always stacked with crocheted blankets for sale. Her side business the moment Beverly mentioned the drowning. Irene's face clouded over. Years ago, Irene began, "We had a different set of board members, kind, honest folks who volunteered to help the neighborhood. They got replaced by so-called professionals who were more concerned about property values than people. She rocked gently in her chair, eyes distant. They introduced restrictions left and right, but no one suspected they'd go this far. Irene revealed that the board's push to reduce emergency calls began when the developer threatened to withhold fund for the new tennis courts if the community racked up too many official safety incidents. They wanted the squeakiest clean record to get more outside investments, Irene said, voice tinged with bitterness. All it takes is a few 911 calls and the development company raises an eyebrow. Then the property manager's job is on the line. The board members get negative press and the developer walks away. Beverly's stomach churned, so it all boiled down to money and expansion projects. It was disgusting, but it fit the pattern. She thanked Irene and made her way home, anger fueling every step. Meanwhile, tensions had reached a boiling point in the neighborhood. A growing group of outraged residents demanded a board recall vote lawn signs reading, "Our lives matter more than PR," popped up on corners, and a storm of social media posts hammered away at the board's credibility. Some longtime residents were hesitant, fearful that if they ousted the board, the neighborhood might plunge into chaos. But for Beverly, chaos seemed preferable to lethal indifference. The next day, Martin found a flyer taped to their front door, HOA Emergency Town Hall. Open discussion on pool tragedy. It would be held at the main clubhouse that same evening. The flyer was official, brandishing the HOA seal. "At least they're trying for damage control," Martin muttered. Beverly nodded. She was determined to demand accountability that night. The clubhouse was more packed than before. Every chair filled with a standing crowd lining the walls. Darlene appeared once again, flanked by 2 other board members. She looked drawn with dark circles under her eyes, as though she hadn't slept in days. The hush was deafening. Darlene spoke first, voice small but resolute. "We understand the outrage you all feel. We share in the grief." She offered a brief moment of silence for Jillian, which was met with solemn cooperation. After a pause, she continued, "We want to hear your concerns and take steps to move forward in a positive direction, so let's begin." Immediately, hands shot into the air. The first question, why not just let lifeguards call 911? Immediately, that's basic life-saving protocol. Murmurs of agreement rippled across the room. Darlene tightened her jaw, choosing her words carefully. "We have recognized that restricting emergency calls was a grave mistake. The board will be amending our guidelines too late." Someone interrupted. "You say that now." After someone died, Beverly's hand rose and she didn't wait to be called on. She spoke clearly, her voice trembling with a mix of nerves and righteous fury. "We've seen minutes from your meetings referencing liability and incident mitigation. We know your plan was to keep the community's record clean for investors or expansions. Is that correct?" Darlene's eyes flicked to the board members beside her. They looked equally uneasy. "It's true we discussed how best to handle minor incidents, but we never intended to prohibit genuine emergencies." Peter, the young lifeguard, stood next. His voice quavered with all due respect. "Ma'am, that's not what you told us during training. You said calling 911 could damage the community's reputation. You told us the board needed to decide if an incident was big enough to warrant official involvement. You threatened to write us up or fire us. If we violated that rule, the tension in the room exploded like a thunderclap." Residents erupted in shouts, curses, and condemnations. Darlene struggled to maintain order. But the anger was now a powerful wave surging toward the board. Some demanded resignations. Others threatened lawsuits seeking criminal negligence charges. Amid the roar, Beverly found herself trembling, not from fear, but from the realization that the community might finally be united in doing the right thing. Darlene tried to salvage the meeting, promising new policies and improved safety protocols. But no one seemed convinced. The illusions have been shattered by the meeting's end. A newly formed concerned resident committee had announced plans for a formal recall. The seeds of rebellion were planted and well watered by grief and fury. As Beverly stepped into the warm night air, she felt both exhausted and strangely hopeful. The blowback against this inhumane policy was massive, and she could sense the tide turning. Even the older couples, once content to let the HOA handle everything, now recognized that complacency had a price, and that price was a life. A neighbor, a friend, in the days that followed the Concerned Residents Committee, sprang into action with a vigor Beverly never expected from what was typically a quiet, easygoing neighborhood. A thick packet of recall petitions was distributed door to door. With volunteers urging residents to sign, they had enough signatories within 48 hours, well beyond the threshold needed to force a special election to remove Darlene and the other board members. But the board wasn't surrendering without a fight. A glossy mailer showed up in every resident's mailbox, courtesy of the HOA, emblazed with
the words, "Stay the course for stability. Reject the knee-jerk recall." It cited the board's record of success in improving amenities, boosting property values, and maintaining a pristine community. The drowning tragedy was framed as an unforeseeable accident. "Don't let emotional fervor tear our community apart," it read. For many, it was too little too late. They're using marketing spin to cover up their negligence. Martin fumed as he read the pamphlet at the kitchen table. He tossed it onto the counter with disgust. Beverly was equally incensed, but tried to remain practical. They would need more than anger. They needed a strategic plan to ensure the recall succeeded a week before the special election. The local newspaper caught wind of the scandal. A reporter came to Fairview Lake snapping photos of a now empty pool, where lifeguards sat idly in the stands looking demoralized. The pool rule sign had been updated hastily, with an extra bold line that read, "Call 911 for any emergency." It felt like a hollow gesture after Jillian's loss. The reporter interviewed neighbors, capturing raw emotion, tears, tremors of anger, recollections of how quickly Jillian's life slipped away. He tried to interview Darlene too, but she offered only a curt statement about reviewing policies and deep sorrow for the family. The resulting article was damning, painting the Fairview Lake Board as a body more concerned with image than human life. An outraged public response poured in with letters to the editor condemning the board and urging support for the recall. With the community rowing, some board loyalists tried to sabotage the recall efforts. One day, Beverly noticed a volunteer recounting how the Concerned Residents Committee signs posted at the clubhouse lawn were mysteriously disappearing. A middle-aged man who oversaw maintenance was spotted removing them, claiming they violated visual guidelines soon enough. Martin and a group of neighbors confronted the maintenance worker, forcing him to admit he was acting under instructions from above. They reinstalled the signs, doubling their number to make a statement. Tensions escalated further when an attorney for the victim's family announced a lawsuit, alleging wrongful death and negligence by both the HOA and its board members. The lawsuit's allegations were severe, that the board's explicit policy delayed crucial medical intervention, resulting in Jillian's death. Many in Fairview Lake believe this was the final nail in the coffin for the current board. But Darlene wasn't giving up. She held a press conference in front of the clubhouse, flanked by 2 attorneys and a PR representative with cameras rolling. She read from a prepared statement, "We categorically deny that our policies prevented the calling of 911, she announced, hands shaking slightly. "We have a written protocol that ensures immediate attention to serious emergencies. We are deeply saddened by the tragic accident at the pool, but any claims of a deliberate attempt to avoid contacting emergency services are false. We will vigorously defend our community's reputation." Beverly stood on the sidelines, heart pounding in anger. Peter, the lifeguard, was there too. She caught his eye. He gave a small, furious shake of his head. He knew the board was lying through their teeth. As the cameras turned off, a crowd of incensed residents bombarded Darlene and her team with questions they refused to answer. The tension was so thick it felt like a rubber band ready to snap. Then the day of the recall election arrived like a storm front. A line formed at the clubhouse from morning to evening as residents queued to cast their votes. The process was both tense and oddly cathartic. Families who never engaged in HOA politics before now stood with fierce determination. A sign outside read, "Your vote, your voice, remember Jillian." Late that night, the votes were tallied. The entire community seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the announcement. At close to midnight, one of the recall committee members stepped onto the clubhouse steps, reading from a slip of paperboard. President Darlene Scott is recalled from office by a vote of 73% to 27%. The other board members facing recall have also been removed by similar margins. A roaring cheer erupted. Car horns sounded in the parking lot. Some even wept, clutching each other in relief. The longtime residents who had once quietly endured the board's strong-armed tactics smiled through tears. For many, the victory was bittersweet. It wouldn't bring Jillian back, but it was a decisive rebuke of the HOA's twisted priorities. The next few days flew by in a whirlwind of celebrations. Transitional board meetings and planning for a new election to fill the vacant seats. Neighbors who had never spoken before bonded over a shared sense of justice. Beverly felt an unaccustomed camaraderie in the air, like the community was waking from spell. Martin was overjoyed, though. He still carried guilt replaying the moment he jumped in the pool, wondering if he had done enough or acted fast enough, despite the sense of vindication. The heartbreak of Jillian's tragedy remained raw. Her family was still grieving her house on the cul-de-sac. Eerily quiet bouquets of flowers and sympathy cards covered their porch steps in an unspoken agreement. The residents steered clear of celebrating the recall near the Connolly home. They wanted to give the family space to mourn, but the seeds of meaningful change were sprouting across Fairview Lake. Eager volunteers stepped up to serve on an interim board. They promised a swift repeal of any policy that stifled emergency response proposals, to install better safety equipment at the pool, like advanced life-saving devices and more training for lifeguards were already in the works. A new era was dawning, shaped by the painful lessons of Jillian's final moments. A crisp autumn wind swept through Fairview Lake, a sign that the tumultuous summer had given way to a season of reflection, and rebuilding the pool was closed for the year. A blue tarp, stretched tightly across its surface, sealed off like a silent memorial to the tragedy across the community. Normal routines slowly resumed. Dog walkers strolled the paths. Tennis players took to the courts, and kids in bright backpacks hopped onto school buses. Yet an unmistakable gravity lingered, especially among residents who had watched events unfold over the past few months. The newly elected interim board wasted no time. They met weekly in the same clubhouse room, once dominated by Darlene and her allies. Beverly took on a volunteer role as a community liaison, responsible for gathering input from neighbors and relaying it to the board. She was astonished at how much relief came simply from being heard. No longer were people's concerns swept under the rug. At one of the first meetings, the board voted unanimously to adopt a complete transparency directive. This required publicly posting all policy changes online and organizing open forums for resident feedback. The highlight was the formal repeal of the old incident mitigation policy, replaced by a new plainly worded rule: if you see a potentially life-threatening emergency, call 911 immediately, no disclaimers, no loopholes. Peter, the young lifeguard, attended that meeting after the vote. He approached Beverly, face flushed with relief, almost quit lifeguarding. He confessed, "I couldn't bear the thought of going back to that chair after everything." He paused, voice trembling, but now knowing the policy has changed and seeing how the community came together, "It reminds me why I became a lifeguard in the first place, to save lives, not to protect anyone's PR image." Beverly placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for doing what you could that day. I know it wasn't enough to save Jillian, but your courage matters. Don't let the board's old mistakes define you." As fall deepened, Martin and Beverly joined others in planting a small memorial garden near the pool entrance. With the Connolly family's blessing, they called it the Jillian Connolly Reflection Garden. A simple plaque read, "In memory of a beloved neighbor who loved this community, may we honor her life by protecting each other." The garden became a spot where people could pause, reflect, and remember that their suburban world was not immune to tragedy or injustice. Meanwhile, the wrongful death lawsuit proceeded through the courts. The Connolly family's lawyer gathered evidence, which included documents from the old board internal emails and testimony from the lifeguards. Although the legal process would take months, if not years, the revelations shook residents anew. The board's behind-the-scenes communications clearly show they worried about bad optics more than safety. They even had a working draft of an updated No 9/11 policy they planned to finalize before the next pool season. The discovery of these documents stung like salt in an open wound. But if there was a silver lining, it It was the unity that blossomed among residents. The old divides between younger families and older retirees, between new arrivals and longtime residents, melted away under a shared commitment to rebuilding trust. An older gentleman, Mr. Ortega, began hosting monthly meetups at his home for neighbors to discuss the next big changes.
Beverly was struck by how engaged people were now, that they knew how high the stakes could get. During one of these meetups, a neighbor proposed installing advanced emergency equipment like an automated external defibrillator, AED, and special rescue devices at the pool. The idea was unanimously embraced. Another suggested forging a partnership with a local fire station for periodic safety training. They raised funds through a community bake sale and a raffle, collecting more than enough to cover the costs. By Thanksgiving, the new equipment was installed, and training sessions were scheduled as the new board prepared for the holiday season. They announced a candlelight vigil in Jillian's honor. It was held by the edge of the reflection garden on a chilly evening. Families came with thermoses of hot cocoa, clasping flickering candles that cast gentle glows across tear-streaked faces. Jillian's husband Todd was there, standing quietly with their teenage daughter Lucy. It was the first time Lucy had attended a public event since her mother's passing. She listened as neighbor after neighbor spoke fondly of Jillian, her warmth, her laugh, her kindness. In small moments, then Lucy stepped forward, candle trembling in her hand. Her voice was soft but clear. "I just want to say thank you. Thank you for not forgetting my mom. We can't change what happened, but maybe someone else will be saved because of the changes you're making." Her words hung in the cold night air. Beverly felt tears slip down her cheeks. In that moment, she realized that while justice was still unfolding, the community had already embraced a deeper transformation. It was no longer about property values or insurance rates or polished reputations. It was about doing what was right that evening. As the vigil ended, Beverly and Martin walked home, arms linked against the bite of the wind they passed through the winding streets of Fairview Lake. The same ones that once seemed so pristine and untroubled in the distance. They could see the faint outline of the pool closed for the season, dark under the night sky. In a few months, come summer, children would splash in its waters again. Lifeguards, newly empowered, would stand ready to protect them without hesitation or bureaucratic fear. It was a small solace, but it was real. The next morning, Beverly woke with renewed conviction. She didn't consider herself an activist or a revolutionary, but she had seen firsthand what silence and complacency could cost. Sometimes it took a tragedy to wake people up to the fragility of life and the responsibilities we share in caring for one another. Jillian's loss would never be fully healed, but as the community carried her memory forward, they discovered a shared compassion and determination that reshaped Fairview Lake from the inside out. And though it came at a terrible price, they vowed never to forget that a single phone call, one seemingly simple act of caring, could be the difference between life and death.